Have you ever noticed how the harshest voice you hear isn't coming from the person across from you, but from the space between your own ears? It's that subtle, persistent commentary that starts the moment the world goes quiet. When the workday ends, when the dishes are done, or when you're just staring out the window for a second too long, that's when it arrives. It starts with the small things, the way you dropped your keys and felt a surge of heat in your chest, or the way you stumbled over a single word in a meeting and replayed it 50 times on the drive home. We've become so accustomed to this internal friction that we've mistaken it for a necessary part of who we are. We've branded it as ambition or accountability, convinced that if we aren't constantly pointing out our own flaws, we'll simply stop growing. But there is a heavy, invisible price to pay for living in a house where the host is constantly pointing out the dust on the floor. It is profoundly exhausting to be both the person trying to live and the person constantly judging the attempt. Imagine for a second if you talked to a friend the way you talk to yourself in the mirror. You would never tell them they were a failure because they forgot an email. You would never look at someone you love and tell them they are unworthy of rest because they didn't finish their entire to-do list. Yet, when it comes to our own hearts, we act like both the prisoner and the guard. This echo in the quiet moments isn't just noise. It's a barrier. It keeps us from actually feeling the life we are working so hard to build. We tend to believe that self-criticism is the whip that keeps us moving forward. But in reality, it's the weight that makes the walk so much harder. When you live in a state of constant self-surveillance, you aren't actually growing. You're just surviving your own judgment. You find yourself bracing for the next mistake before it even happens, living in a state of pre-disappointment, where you criticize yourself first just so it doesn't hurt as much when the world does it later. It's a defense mechanism that has overstayed its welcome. Carl Jung once suggested that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. We find it terrifying because we've been told that acceptance is the same as giving up. We fear that if we stop the criticism, we'll lose our edge. But the opposite is true. When the echo of that harsh voice finally softens, you don't stop moving. You just stop dragging 100 pounds of shame behind you. You start to realize that the quiet moments don't have to be filled with an inventory of your shortcomings. They can just be quiet. You can just be. Think about how much energy it takes to maintain that wall of judgment. Think about the tension in your shoulders when you realize you've been mean to yourself for the last 3 hours without even realizing it. This shift from criticism to compassion doesn't happen with a loud explosion. It happens in these tiny, hushed intervals. It happens when you catch the echo starting up. That familiar, "Why did you say that?" or "You should be further along by now." And you choose, just for a second, not to agree with it. You don't have to fight the voice. You just have to stop feeding it. You have to recognize that you are the one listening to the noise, which means you are not the noise itself. You are the space where the noise happens, and that space is allowed to be peaceful. You are allowed to be a person who makes mistakes, and still deserves to sit in the quiet without being attacked by your own mind. We carry around these invisible blueprints of who we should be, tucking them away in our pockets like heavy stones we've forgotten we are even holding. Maybe your blueprint is the version of you that never gets tired, the one who can work a full day, maintain a perfect home, and still have enough emotional energy to be everything to everyone else. Or perhaps it's the version of you that handles every conflict with perfect, unshakable grace, never raising a voice or feeling a flicker of petty resentment. We look at these idealized sketches and mistake them for the minimum requirement for being okay. When the reality of being human, being messy, being exhausted, or being deeply uncertain clashes with that blueprint, the criticism doesn't just whisper, it screams. We treat our human limitations like moral failures rather than natural boundaries. You wouldn't expect a bridge to hold a weight it wasn't built for, nor would you get angry at a flower for not blooming in the middle of winter. Yet you demand yourself to carry the expectations of 5 different people without ever showing a crack. We have created a culture of never enough, where resting feels like a crime and having an off day feels like a character flaw. We look at the highlights of everyone else's lives and compare them to our own behind-the-scenes footage, wondering why we can't seem to match the edited, filtered versions of the world around us. This weight is cumulative. It's not just one big expectation. It's the 1,000 tiny shoulds that pile up from the moment you wake up. I should be more productive. I should be happier. I should have figured this out by now. These thoughts act like a slow-moving flaw that obscures the very real progress you are actually making. We become so focused on the gap between where we are and where we should be that we stop seeing how far we've traveled. We are so busy mourning the perfect version of ourselves that we fail to appreciate the brave, resilient, and remarkably capable person who is actually standing here, doing the best they can with the tools they have. Carl Jung spoke of the persona, the mask we wear to meet the demands of society. But when the mask becomes more important than the face beneath it, we begin to suffer. We start to believe that only the mask is worthy of love, and that the tired, struggling person underneath is someone to be ashamed of. But the standards we've set for ourselves are often built on foundations that don't even belong to us. They are inherited from parents, from old teachers, or from a society that profits from our insecurity. We are trying to win a game where the rules keep changing, and the goalposts are always being moved. Real compassion starts when we finally set the stones down. It's the moment you look at that blueprint of the perfect you and realize it's actually a cage. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to not have the answer. You are allowed to be a person who is still learning how to navigate the world. Healing doesn't happen when you finally reach those impossible standards. It happens when you decide you don't need them anymore to justify your existence. It's the profound relief of realizing that your value isn't something you have to earn through endless achievement. You are not a project to be finished. You are a human being to be lived. When you stop trying to be the perfect version of yourself, you finally give the real you enough room to breathe. We spend an incredible amount of energy trying to hide the parts of ourselves we find unacceptable. We've built high walls around the envy that flares up when a friend succeeds, the exhaustion we're ashamed to admit, and the perceived weakness of needing someone else's hand to hold. We push these feelings down into the basement of our hearts, locking the door and hoping they'll just disappear if we ignore them long enough. We tell ourselves that if we can just be good enough or strong enough, those darker, heavier pieces of our humanity will eventually wither away. But the things we bury don't stay dead. They just grow in the dark, waiting for a moment when we're too tired to keep the door shut. This is what we call the shadow, the collection of all the traits, memories, and impulses we've been taught to reject. And more often than not, the world around us becomes a mirror for that shadow. Have you ever noticed how someone else's minor habit can move you to a state of absolute, irrational irritation? Or how you might feel a sharp, cold judgment toward someone who is being too loud or too emotional? As Carl Jung famously noted, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When we react with intense self-loathing or outward judgment toward certain flaws, we are usually reacting to the parts of our own shadow that we haven't integrated yet. We aren't really mad at the world. We are struggling with the reflection we see in it. The more we push those parts away, the louder they scream for our attention. It's like trying to keep a beach ball underwater. It takes constant, straining effort, and eventually, it's going to pop up to the surface with a force that's hard to control. We've been conditioned to think that self-discovery is about finding the light and the best version of ourselves. But real healing is actually much more grounded than that. It doesn't come from cutting those shadow parts out or performing a kind of internal surgery to remove the bad bits. It comes from finally walking down into that basement, turning on the light, and looking at what's there without flinching. It's the moment you look at your own anger and realize it's actually a wounded part of you trying to set a boundary. It's looking at your laziness and realizing it's actually a body that is desperate for safety and rest. When we stop viewing these parts as enemies to be conquered, the mirror changes. The world feels less like a series of threats and more like a conversation. We begin to realize that the unacceptable parts of us are often just qualities that were misunderstood or neglected when we were younger. By bringing these parts into the light, we stop being haunted by them. We start to understand that being a whole person means being a complex person. You can be kind and still feel anger. You can be successful and still feel uncertain. Integrating the shadow isn't about becoming perfectly good. It's about becoming whole. It's about ending the civil war inside yourself. When you finally stop fighting the reflection in the mirror, you realize that the person looking back at you doesn't need to be fixed. They just need to be known. there is a profound, quiet power in saying to yourself, I see you, I hear you, and you belong here too. That is where the hating ends and the real living begins. There's a strange, almost seductive comfort in self-criticism. It's a habit we pick up early, often as a way to survive a world that felt unpredictable. We start to believe that if we are the first ones to point out our flaws, no one else can surprise us with them. It's like building a fortress out of sharp glass. It's painful to live inside, but we feel safe because we think we've anticipated every possible strike. We tell ourselves, if I call myself a failure first, it won't hurt as much when I don't get the promotion. Or, if I obsess over my social awkwardness, I'm somehow preventing myself from being rejected. We use shame as a shield, but a shield made of shame only ends up heavy and cold, pinning us to the ground. This internal lashing is a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to stay in control of a life that often feels chaotic. By beating yourself up, you feel like you're doing something productive about the problem. It feels like work. We confuse the ache of self-loathing with the effort of self-improvement. But criticism is a blunt tool. It's meant for demolition, not for architecture. It can break things down, but it rarely has the delicacy required to build them back up. You cannot hate yourself into a version of yourself that you love. It's a fundamental law of the heart that we try to break every single day. It's like trying to make a garden grow by shouting at the soil or punishing the seeds for not sprouting fast enough. You might see a few things push through the dirt out of sheer survival, but nothing will ever truly bloom in an environment of fear. We often cling to this harshness because we are terrified of what might happen if we let it go. We worry that if we stop the criticism, we'll become lazy or complacent, or that we'll lose our edge. We mistake the whip for the engine. But the engine, the thing that actually moves us toward a life of meaning, isn't powered by how much we dislike our current selves. It's powered by curiosity, by the desire to contribute, and by the basic human need to connect. When you criticize yourself to gain control, you aren't actually steering the ship. You're just screaming at the waves. You're exhausting your spirit on a battle that has no winner. Think about the physical toll of this illusion. Think about how your jaw tightens or how your breath becomes shallow the moment you start that familiar internal lecture. That tension is the cost of trying to control the uncontrollable. Carl Jung once observed that the pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. Our self-criticism often masquerades as right, as a moral necessity, but it is frequently just the nonsense of a scared heart trying to find a footing. True control doesn't come from the ability to punish yourself into submission. It comes from the stability of self-acceptance. When you are no longer at war with your own nature, you can finally see your situation clearly. You can see your mistakes not as evidence of your worthlessness, but as simple human errors that can be corrected. You start to realize that you don't need the illusion of control when you have the reality of resilience. Letting go of the critic doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you finally start caring enough to give yourself a chance to succeed without a weight around your neck. You realize that the most effective way to navigate the world is not by being your own harshest judge, but by being the one person you can always rely on for a fair hearing. Think about the last time you felt like you weren't enough. It usually doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It's more like a sudden, cold draft in a room you thought was warm. Maybe you were scrolling through a screen and saw someone else's highlight reel. A promotion, a clean house, a perfect vacation, and felt that sharp, familiar pang in your chest. Or maybe it was smaller. A text message left on read, a joke that didn't land, or the realization that you've reached the end of another week without finishing that one task you promised yourself you'd tackle. In those moments, there is a specific kind of sting, a sinking feeling that whispers you are falling behind in a race you didn't even realize you were running. This sting is so familiar that we've started to treat it like a permanent resident in our hearts. We've learned to anticipate it, almost welcoming it as a sign that we're still trying. But that heavy sensation in your chest isn't a sign that you are broken. And it's certainly not a sign that you are failing at life. It is a sign of a deep, painful disconnection. It's the sound of your own spirit crying out because it's being held to a standard that ignores your humanity. We have been conditioned to believe that compassion is a reward for perfection, something we are allowed to feel only after we've fixed every flaw, met every deadline, and satisfied every expectation. We treat kindness like a trophy at the end of a long, grueling marathon. But compassion isn't the finish line. It's the fuel you need just to put the key in the ignition. When you feel that sting, your instinct is usually to tighten up. You hold your breath, you harden your heart, and you tell yourself to get it together. You try to outrun the feeling by working harder or judging yourself more severely. But you can't outrun a shadow. The sting doesn't go away because you've punished yourself. It only goes away when you stop to acknowledge it. It's about recognizing the physical reality of that moment, the tightness in your throat or the heaviness in your stomach, and realizing that you are suffering. We often miss this because we are too busy analyzing why we feel bad. We get lost in the why instead of tending to the what. We tell ourselves we shouldn't feel this way because we have so much to be grateful for, or because others have it worse. But pain isn't a math problem, and it doesn't care about logic. When you ignore the sting, it just moves deeper. Carl Jung pointed out that man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. When that sting presses upward, it's asking you to notice the gap between the person you are pretending to be and the person you actually are. Recognizing the sting is the first step toward closing that gap. It's the moment you stop and say, "This hurts right now." And that's okay. It's the realization that your worth is not a variable that changes based on how well you handled your afternoon or how you compared to a stranger on the internet. Your worth is the constant. The sting is just a reminder that you've forgotten to be on your own side. The next time you feel it, try not to turn away. Don't try to fix it immediately. Just recognize it as a signal that you are being too hard on a person who is doing their best. You are allowed to feel that sting, but you don't have to let it tell you who you are. Transitioning from judgment to understanding requires a fundamental shift in perspective, one that feels less like a climb and more like a surrender. For most of our lives, we've treated our internal struggles as enemies to be defeated, or at the very least, as unruly guests we need to manage. We view our anxiety, our sadness, or our feelings of inadequacy as glitches in the system that need to be patched. But true integration begins when we stop seeing these parts as problems to be solved and start seeing them as messengers with something vital to say. We have to stop the war within ourselves to finally hear the wisdom that's been drowned out by the noise of our own self-defense. This shift is rarely comfortable. In fact, Carl Jung suggested that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This isn't because we are inherently bad or evil, but because total acceptance requires us to give up the polished, perfect fantasy of who we think we should be. It means standing in the middle of our lives and acknowledging that we are messy, contradictory, and beautifully unfinished. It's the moment you stop trying to curate your personality and start inhabiting your humanity. Integration isn't about fixing yourself so that you never feel negative emotions again. It's about creating enough space inside of you so that those emotions can exist without taking over the steering wheel. When we move toward integration, we begin to look at our flaws through the lens of history rather than the lens of shame. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" we start to ask, "What happened to me that made this part of me feel like it had to be so loud?" You might realize that your tendency to over-criticize is actually a part of you that learned to be hyper-vigilant as a child to stay safe. You might see that your fear of being seen is actually a protector that wants to shield you from rejection. When you approach yourself with this kind of curious empathy, the monster in the room starts to look a lot more like a scared, tired child. You realize that you don't need to banish these parts. You need to lead them. This process is like weaving a tapestry. For years, you've been trying to pull out the dark threads, thinking they ruin the pattern. But integration is the realization that the dark threads provide the depth and the contrast that make the whole image visible. Without your struggles, you wouldn't have your resilience. Without your sensitivity, you wouldn't have your empathy. By accepting the whole of who you are, you stop leaking energy into the constant effort of suppression. Imagine the relief of finally stopping the fight. Think about all the mental and emotional space that opens up when you are no longer monitoring yourself for mistakes or hiding your true feelings. When you stop fighting yourself, you suddenly have all that reclaimed energy to actually move forward, to create, and to connect with others in a way that is authentic rather than performed. You move from a state of fragmentation, where you are constantly at odds with different versions of yourself, to a state of wholeness. You don't become a different person. You simply become the person you were always meant to be before you started apologizing for your existence. Integration is the quiet, brave act of coming home to yourself and deciding that, for once, you are going to stay. Compassion is often misunderstood as a form of weakness, a way of letting ourselves off the hook, or making excuses for our shortcomings. We fear that if we stop the harsh inner dialogue, we'll lose our momentum and drift into stagnation. But the language of compassion isn't about being soft in a way that leads to giving up. It's actually about being incredibly accurate. It is the practice of looking at a moment of struggle and choosing the most honest words possible to describe it. It's the difference between saying, "I am a failure," and saying, "I am a person who is currently overwhelmed and didn't have the tools I needed to handle this situation the way I wanted to." The first statement is a life sentence. The second is a doorway. When we speak to ourselves with compassion, we are essentially giving ourselves the same grace we would offer a close friend who just had a long, difficult day. Think about how you treat someone you love when they stumble. You don't pull out a list of their past mistakes and read them aloud. You don't tell them they'll never amount to anything because they missed a deadline. Instead, you offer them a chair, a glass of water, and the space to breathe. You recognize their humanity. The language of compassion is simply the act of finally extending that same invitation to yourself. It's the realization that your worth isn't a variable that changes based on your productivity, your mood, or the opinion of a stranger. It is a constant, steady flame that stays lit even when you can't see it. This shift in language changes the very chemistry of our internal lives. Criticism triggers our fight or flight response, leaving us tense, reactive, and unable to think clearly. But compassion activates our system of safety and connection. When we tell ourselves, "This is hard right now, and I'm doing my best," we aren't lying to ourselves. We are settling our nervous systems so we can actually find a way forward. It's much easier to fix a mistake when you aren't busy trying to survive the shame of making it. Compassion provides the steady ground you need to stand on while you figure things out. Using this language requires a kind of daily, quiet vigilance. It means catching yourself in the middle of a self-shaming spiral and gently interrupting it. It's about replacing "I should have known better" with "I'm learning as I go." It's about honoring the fact that you are navigating a complex world with a heart that feels things deeply. This isn't about toxic positivity or pretending everything is perfect. It's about acknowledging the struggle without making the struggle your identity. It's about being a reliable witness to your own life. Imagine what your days would feel like if the primary voice you heard wasn't a prosecutor, but a mentor. A mentor doesn't ignore your mistakes. They help you learn from them without destroying your spirit. They believe in your potential, even when you're having a bad day. By adopting the language of compassion, you stop being your own most difficult obstacle and start being your own most reliable ally. You realize that you don't need to be perfect to be worthy of your own kindness. In fact, it is in your most imperfect moments that your kindness is needed the most. It is the bridge that carries you from the person you were yesterday to the person you are becoming today. And it's a bridge that is built one gentle word at a time. Growth is rarely a straight line, and it is almost never quiet. There will be days when you feel like you've finally turned a corner, only to wake up and find the old habits of self-doubt knocking at your door again. It's in these moments that the sting returns, and our first instinct is usually to run. We try to distract ourselves with busyness, with noise, or with the familiar comfort of judging ourselves for sliding backward. We get angry at our own hearts for feeling heavy, as if we're frustrated that we haven't cured our humanity yet. But the secret to moving through these shadows isn't to outrun them. It's to learn how to sit with them. Sitting with the uncomfortable means resisting the urge to fix, judge, or push away the feelings that scare you. It's about creating a quiet space where your anxiety, your grief, or your uncertainty can just exist for a moment without you trying to turn them into something else. Instead of getting angry that you're back at square one, try to look at that feeling as a guest passing through. Note it. Acknowledge that the critic inside you is flaring up because it's trying to protect you from being hurt again, even if its methods are outdated and painful. You don't have to agree with what the critic is saying, but you can acknowledge that it's there. As Carl Jung observed, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Choice doesn't always look like a grand, heroic action. Sometimes, choice looks like staying still when you want to flee. It's the decision to say, "I feel a deep sense of inadequacy right now, and I am going to breathe through it, rather than letting it dictate my day." When you sit with the uncomfortable, you realize that feelings are like weather. They are intense, they can be overwhelming, but they are not the sky. You are the sky. The storm can rage, the wind can howl, but the sky remains, vast and unchanged, holding it all. This practice changes your relationship with yourself because it builds trust. When you don't abandon yourself the moment things get difficult, you start to feel a new kind of inner stability. You realize that you can survive a bad mood, a moment of rejection, or a wave of doubt without the world ending. You learn that the uncomfortable parts of life aren't signs that you're doing it wrong. They are just part of the landscape. Imagine the power in being a person who isn't afraid of their own internal world. Think about the freedom that comes when you no longer have to spend your life avoiding certain thoughts or feelings. You are not the criticism you hear in your head. You are the one listening to it. And that means you are the one who gets to decide how much weight it holds. By sitting with the discomfort, you aren't giving in to it. You're proving to yourself that you are stronger than it. You are teaching your heart that it is a safe place to be, even when it's hurting. You're learning that you don't have to run away from yourself to find peace. You just have to stay long enough for the storm to pass. Self-discovery isn't about finding a new version of yourself or building a persona from scratch that finally meets the world's approval. It is actually a much deeper, quieter process of excavation. It's about uncovering the person who was already there, long before the world told you who you were supposed to be and what you had to achieve to be worthy of space. For years, we have built our lives on the shifting sands of external validation and the rigid pillars of self-criticism. We thought that if we were just hard enough on ourselves, we could create a structure that would never break. But a foundation built on judgment is brittle. It cracks the moment life gets heavy. Building a new foundation means choosing a different material entirely, the steady, grounded reality of self-compassion. This new foundation is built in the small, seemingly insignificant moments of your day. It's built when you wake up feeling behind, and instead of rushing into a panic, you take one deep breath and tell yourself, I am allowed to start at my own pace. It's built when you make a mistake at work, and instead of letting it define your entire identity, you acknowledge it as a human error and move on. These choices might feel small, like laying a single brick at a time, but they are what eventually create a life that can weather any storm. You are learning to trust your own timing, even when it doesn't match the frantic rhythm of the people around you. If you need to rest, you rest, not as a reward for finishing everything, but as a basic requirement for being alive. We often resist this because we've been taught that being firm with ourselves is the only way to stay safe. We worry that if we build a foundation on kindness, we'll become soft or lose our way. But as Carl Jung observed, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Becoming who you truly are requires a foundation that is flexible enough to hold your growth and strong enough to support your failures. A foundation of self-compassion doesn't make you less capable. It makes you more resilient. It means that when you do stumble, and we all do, you aren't falling into a dark pit of shame. You are falling onto solid ground that you have spent time preparing. This shift changes how you view your future. Instead of looking ahead and seeing a series of tests you might fail, you start to see a path you are walking with a trusted friend. The foundation of self-compassion is the quiet, daily decision to stop being your own most difficult obstacle and start being your own most reliable ally. It is the realization that you don't have to wait for someone else to give you permission to be okay with yourself. You can grant that permission right now. Think about the relief of finally knowing that your home, your internal world, is a place of safety rather than a place of trial. You are no longer trying to justify your existence through endless productivity or perfect behavior. You are simply existing, and that is enough. This new foundation allows you to take risks, to be vulnerable, and to reach out to others, because you are no longer terrified of what will happen if things don't go perfectly. You have built a place within yourself where you are always welcome, regardless of how the day went. It is the brave, quiet work of reclaiming your own life, brick by brick, until you are finally standing on a foundation that can never be taken away from you. At the end of the day, you are the only person you will ever spend every single second with. From the first breath you took to the very last one, you are your own constant companion. It is a long, exhausting journey to walk with someone you don't like, someone you are constantly berating, or someone you feel you have to hide from. We spent so much of our lives trying to escape the reality of being human, as if being human were a condition to be cured rather than an experience to be lived. But the ultimate freedom doesn't come from finally reaching perfection. It comes from the moment you decide to let the armor fall and embrace the beautiful, messy reality of your own existence. When you step into the freedom of being human, you stop treating your life like a performance and start treating it like an experience. You realize that you were never meant to be a finished product, a polished statue, or a perfect machine. You are a living, breathing process. You are a collection of stories, some of which are still being written, and some of which have plot holes and difficult chapters. And that is okay. You are allowed to be a work in progress. You are allowed to take up space in this world without having to provide a list of reasons why you deserve to be here. Your right to exist isn't something you have to earn. It is your birthright. Carl Jung once said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." This is the horn of your freedom. You don't have to follow the blueprint someone else drew for you. You don't have to feel guilty for needing more time, more rest, or a different path than the people you see around you. When you trade self-criticism for self-compassion, the world doesn't necessarily get easier. The challenges are still there. The setbacks still happen. But you become much better at navigating it because you are no longer fighting yourself while you fight the world. You've ended the Civil War. You've decided that if the whole world is against you, at least you will have yourself. There is a profound lightness that comes when you stop shoulding all over your life. I should be further along. I should feel differently. I should be better. When those shoulds and musts go, you finally have the space to ask, what do I actually need right now? You start to honor your own pace. You learn that your sensitivity isn't a flaw, your fatigue isn't a failure, and your mistakes are just the way you learn the terrain of your own soul. You realize that you don't have to be perfect to be whole. To be whole is to be everything you are, the light, the shadow, the joy, and the struggle, and to say yes to all of it. This freedom is the quietest kind of revolution. It doesn't require an audience, and it doesn't need validation from the outside. It happens in the privacy of your own mind when you look at a version of yourself that is struggling, and instead of turning away in shame, you reach out with kindness. You realize that the most important relationship you will ever have is the one happening right now, in the quiet, between you and yourself. So, let yourself be human. Let yourself be messy. Let yourself be real. When you finally stop trying to be the hero or the martyr of your own story, you are finally free to just be the author. And that is more than enough. You are here, you are breathing, and you are worthy of your own love. If you've traveled through these stages, you've likely felt the weight of that internal critic more than once. You've felt the sting of those unrealistic blueprints and the exhaustion that comes from being your own most demanding judge. But as we reach the end of this specific conversation, it's important to realize that the end of the script isn't the end of the work. It's the beginning of a different way of moving through the world. The shift from self-criticism to self-compassion isn't a one-time event or a destination you reach and never leave. It is a daily, sometimes hourly, practice of returning to your own side. For so much of our lives, we've been taught that growth is about fixing things. We look at ourselves as if we are a house that needs a constant renovation. Tearing down walls, replacing the floors, trying to make the structure look like something it was never meant to be. But what if we stopped trying to renovate the house and just started living in it? What if we realized that the cracks we've spent years trying to fill are actually the places where the light gets in? There is a profound, grounded peace in finally deciding that you are not a project. You are a person. And a person deserves more than just constant assessment. A person deserves care. As we look back at the ideas of Carl Jung that we've woven through this journey, one thing stands out. The goal of life isn't to be good, but to be whole. Wholeness is a much broader, more generous concept than perfection. Wholeness includes the days you are proud of, but it also has room for the days you'd rather forget. It includes your triumphs and your embarrassments. It includes the parts of you that are brave and the parts of you that are absolutely terrified. When you embrace wholeness, you stop trying to curate a life that looks good from the outside and start building a life that feels good from the inside. This shift changes your relationship with time itself. When you are driven by self-criticism, you are always living in the future, waiting for the day you finally get it together so you can finally be happy. But self-compassion brings you back to the present. It asks you, what do you need right now? It recognizes that you are a biological, emotional being with limits that deserve to be respected. It allows you to move at a pace that is sustainable rather than a pace that is forced. You start to see that the time you spend resting, reflecting, or just being still isn't lost time. It is the time where your foundation is strengthened. The freedom we've talked about isn't a freedom from struggle. Life will still be difficult. People will still let you down. You will still make mistakes. And the world will still feel unpredictable. But the difference is that you will no longer be adding the weight of self-hatred on top of those challenges. You'll be facing them with the strength of someone who knows they have a safe place to return to, themselves. You become a sanctuary for your own heart. Think about the physical relief that comes with that. Think about the tension leaving your jaw, the space opening up in your chest, and the way your perspective shifts from "how do I survive this judgment?" to "how do I navigate this moment?" That is the quiet revolution. It doesn't need a crowd, and it doesn't need a stage. It happens in the silence of your own mind when you choose to be kind instead of cruel. It happens when you look at your reflection, and for the first time in a long time, you don't look for what's wrong. You just look at who's there. As you move forward from this script, remember that you don't have to get this right either. There will be days when the critic is loud again. There will be days when you fall back into old patterns of comparison. When that happens, don't use it as an excuse to beat yourself up for failing at self-compassion. Just notice it. Smile at it if you can and say, "There's that old voice again. I know what it's trying to do, but I don't have to listen today." Every moment is an opportunity to start over. Every breath is a chance to be a little bit more patient with the person you are. You are the only you that has ever existed, and the only you that ever will. You carry a unique blend of history, feeling, and potential that the world needs, not in its perfect form, but in its honest form. So, take the blueprints and the heavy stones and set them down. Let yourself be unfinished. Let yourself be human. The journey from self-criticism to self-compassion is the longest journey you will ever take, but it is also the most rewarding. Because at the end of that road, you don't find a perfect version of yourself. You find something much better. You find a friend. You find a home. You find the reality that you were always and have always been enough, just as you are, right here, right now.